Welcome to the New Rules for Work Labs, where we're rewriting the rules of work. In our lab, we glean insights from the world's foremost minds, exploring leadership, team dynamics, creativity, artificial intelligence, and more. Join us as we dissect, analyze, and incubate ideas shaping the future workplace. Stick around to learn how we turn these insights into practical activities. Get ready for a journey into the future of work. This is the New Rules for Work Labs, where insights meet action. Foundational to your work, that this concept of the future self, what is our relationship with the way we think about ourselves to time? It seems to be pretty superficial.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We do engage in a lot of goal setting. We do engage in a lot of what psychologists would call mental time travel, thinking ahead to the future or thinking back on the past. My contention is that we don't always do so with a very deep understanding of the person who will benefit or suffer from the decisions that we're making right now. In other words, that person being us, a version of us at some point in the future. I think if you were to ask somebody, have you ever thought about 5 years from now? Yes, the answer most likely would be yes. Actually, the data suggests that there is about a quarter of people who say that they rarely do that. But nonetheless, it's something we can do. But what you're asking is a slightly different question, which is not only can we think about ourselves over time, but how deeply do we engage in that? How deeply do we actually do that? And I think to some extent, if it was something we did with a great deal of depth, then as I like to say, the gyms would be full and donut shops would have shorter lines and people wouldn't be searching for diets and figuring out ways to save. These are symptoms of, at times, there's always other reasons, but these are symptoms of sometimes not thinking deeply about our future selves.
So you got super interested in this in the past, this relationship with our future self. What is it we get wrong most of the time when we are thinking about who that person is? How do we conceive of it in ways that don't make sense?
Yeah. So sometimes the thing we get wrong is that simply we don't think about it that much. The psychologists and economists talk about something called present bias, which is when we are so overly focused on the present that we sometimes miss out on opportunities to do something for the future. There's other ways in which we get it wrong too. For instance, it's quite nefarious. We actually tell ourselves that we're thinking about the future, but we're doing so in a superficial way. Procrastination is a great example of this. Like when I procrastinate, I am saying to myself that I will do this thing next week or in 2 weeks or whatever it is. But if I really thought deeply about it, if I don't want to take care of paying my property tax bills today, why am I going to want to take care of it or have the time to do it next week or in 2 weeks, right? So I think that's a version of not thinking that deep about the future. And then a final sort of mistake or what we get wrong is taking our feelings in the present and projecting them onto our future selves in a way that's unfair to our future selves. The analogy would be getting a gift for your partner that's representative of something you want. Like I could tell myself, I can come up with all sorts of stories of why I think my wife would love a new espresso machine. And really, that's a gift for me. And something similar may happen at times when we plan for the future, but overly anchor on our present feelings and project them on to our future selves.
So you've completely caught me out. I cannot tell you the number of fabulous puzzles and adventures my husband, who is not so interested in fabulous puzzles and adventures, has received. But I was thinking
That's
about
great.
that from a group context. Is that similar to the end of history illusion, where the group does future planning, assuming that they in the future will be largely like they are today? Basically, like change happened, but then change has stops with who we are now.
That's right. And that's a really good summary of the end of history illusion, which of course has been investigated on the individual level. And the gist is that we recognize that we've changed from the past to the present, but fail to see that we'll continue to change as much moving from the present to the future. Sort of thing that, history has stopped. And you raise a really interesting possibility, which is whether or not that same mistake or illusion occurs at the group level as well. That is this sort of recognition that our culture has changed, our interests have changed from the past to the present, but somehow we've now arrived more or less fully baked. Or, we're as close to as baked as possible and things won't continue to change, when in fact, most likely they will. I would say that it would be a really interesting question to investigate, because my guess is that the rate of progress actually is not so uniform over time, that there probably are periods, and historians would speak to this better than me, but there probably are periods of great change and others with less. But I don't know psychologically where groups fit on that spectrum and how they see things moving forward.
So when we said we don't think about this deeply enough or sophisticated enough, and with this, I buy gifts for myself, even though it's in the name of somebody else. We're not imagining how we might be different in the future.
Yes.
And the reason we get this wrong so often, we're really, really bad at it. It's hard for us to imagine what we might be like. Maybe I won't like chocolate. Maybe I won't like cappuccino.
First off, I think you hit the nail on the head that we're really bad at this. There's a lot of research on what's called affective forecasting, demonstrating the many ways in which we fail to accurately forecast our emotions in the future. We think a positive thing will make us happier than it actually will, and will continue to make us happy. We think that a negative thing, losing our job, breaking up, etc., will make us much sadder than it actually will, and will continue to make us sad over time. And when in fact, the data suggests that neither is the case. There's all sorts of other ways, by the way, that we fail to accurately predict our emotions in the future, some of which has to do with the fact that we often think about the initial future experience and fail to consider like an entire experience. But you bring up this question of why do we have this hard time relating? And I think you're absolutely right. It comes back to this sense that we have a very difficult time simulating the future and also taking into account the ways that external forces will eventually impact us.
This bit where we envision and we can imagine the initial onset of a situation, but not the progression of the situation. Isn't that a basic survival of the species mechanism? Like, who has children when you realize you have to spend time with them through all of the things you have to, like, they're wonderful. And oh my gosh, sometimes they're 12.
That's, I'm sorry, that's a really funny observation. I have this distinct memory. When we found out my wife was pregnant with our first kid, she found out that one of her very best friends was pregnant at the exact same time. And I remember this friend called us and said, "Oh, how amazing is it that we're going to get to raise kids together?" And I had this sort of moment of freezing, and I was like, I have to tell you, all I thought about was the fact that we're going to have babies at the same time. And this idea of raising kids was, that's the entirety of the experience, or the first part of it. And I'm someone who studies this stuff, and I just failed to see that. There's something that's self-protective about that too.
So you've done all of this talking about things you've experimented with that actually work to help nudge us towards making better decisions on behalf of our future self. Some of those strategies?
Sure. I think one of the things, before we talk about strategies, I think it's important to recognize that our future selves can be thought of as if they're other people. And they're other people whose lives we can impact. And the reason I mention that is because I think it can help shed some light on some of the strategies that we might want to put into place. So one of them is more or less directly derived from the great work that charities do to try to get people to donate to charity recipients. They make the charity recipients vivid and they make them emotional. They don't tell you statistics. They don't give you lengthy paragraphs. They show you a picture, or they tell you a story, or they let you know how each dollar that you contribute is going to actually have an impact and what that impact will be. What's happening there is that they're increasing the salience and the vividness of the charity recipients. That creates stronger emotions. That creates action, right? So one of the strategies that we can employ in trying to connect more to our own future selves is to try to make those future selves more vivid. One thing that we've experimented with is literally trying to see what a future self might look like. We've used age progression technology. I laugh at this because it's a little bit cheesy, though the reality is that the technology now is far advanced beyond where it was when I first started working on this years and years ago. Anybody who's been on social media and seen these face aging filters on TikTok and Snapchat, and some of which have been posted to Instagram and whatnot, do a pretty good job of showing you a representation of what you'd look like when you're older. I don't mean to say that logging into TikTok and running that sort of age filter is going to suddenly make you go to the gym and stop spending money frivolously. What we have found is that when age progression techniques are partnered with an opportunity to actually make a change and done so in a realistic way and in a deep way, it can have an impact. So we've recently published a paper, my colleagues and I, where we found that consumers were given the opportunity to see an older version of themselves, coupled with messages discussing the importance of saving for retirement. They were about 16% more likely to make a contribution to their retirement account compared to people who didn't get those images. That's not the only way that we can increase vividness, though. Another exercise that I really like is to write a letter to one's future self and then write a letter back as if you're stepping into the shoes of your future self.
Do you do that like back to back, like right at the same time, or does it matter?
That's a really good question. From a research perspective, I don't know, because we haven't necessarily tested whether it works better or worse if you were to put a week or a day in between. You could make an argument for either way. Like, I could imagine actually giving some space could be better to like really internalize. I could also imagine that maybe you need to be in the same setting. So that's another good research question to ask. I don't have the answer to it. I've recently started playing around with this. Haven't tested this, but in teaching, I've had people first write a letter to their past selves. And then I have them go through the exercise of writing a letter to and then from their future selves. What I've found is that letter writing to a past self really greases the wheels. Makes it easier to get into, quote unquote, time travel machine, if you will. But again, I want to emphasize part of what's happening there is that exercise is making the future self more graspable, more like somebody I can now see. Oh, I am maybe more similar to them or more emotionally involved with them than I had previously thought about, and then take that from there to make a impact on behavior.
So both of those strategies, when I think about them from a group context or group perspective, are akin to some of the movements we see in strategy work of letting go of, here's my mission, vision, values, bullet points that all make us feel nice when we put them on the PowerPoint, but then we ignore, into vivid narrative.
Yes.
As being the way. And you talked about age progression. As somebody who is not super motivated by the idea of doing a lot of age progression at the moment, I'm going to hit that part of my lifespan where I'm not thinking that they're going to show me anything. I'm interested in like working.
Right.
I could imagine applying it to also things like, rather than age progression, just what might I look like if cookies weren't so delicious? And those kinds of different storytelling aspects. Is that really just key, whether you're a group or a person or wherever you are? Is
you said it, painting a picture. ING, the bank in Europe, they recently deployed this really interesting, I think it was more for marketing, but perhaps that had an impact on behavior, technique where they asked people to describe an ideal day in retirement, and then they basically use the AI tools to show that. People upload a photo. This woman says, I see myself running through a field of poppies with my 3 dogs. And like this, she's uploaded a photo and then press a button. And then there's this beautiful picture. I've seen it. It's amazing, of this woman running through a field of poppies with her 1 dog in front, 2 dogs behind her. There's actually other work that's looked at this in a group setting this is community planners in Japan, where they've had like a group they split the team in 2, and then one half is meant to represent future citizens. They come back wearing this sort of future garb. This is extreme. But
sounds fun. Sounds like a cool role playing. Yeah.
I mean, it's
embodied visioning.
Exactly. And it's now the planners have to have a conversation with essentially the descendants, the people who are going to be impacted by this. And there's something funny about it. But what it's doing is it's making the future people who are impacted by present decisions more vivid. It's giving them a voice at the table rather than just, let me just imagine how this will impact. We're still doing that, but it's a much deeper imagination exercise.
It's making it more real, but I think as we think about ourselves, it's also important to really create the separation in this understanding. I love our future selves are other people than who we are now, in realizing that. And then these other techniques are really to make that separation clear between who I am now and who that future self might be. So you thought you were going to say that with the charities example, that one of the activities you could make yourself the charity recipient.
Yeah, that's great.
But just seeing yourself as other. And it sounds like that's
really interesting.
That's
yes.
Going back to that.
Yes.
Why do we do this so poorly is because we think of ourselves in the now as always.
And I would just add something there. This is an analogy that we think of our future selves as another, because there's all sorts of nuance there and we turn into that other and so forth. But it's not so much that we see that separation or that we see our future selves as another, but rather what sort of relationship we have with that other. The viewpoint that I've taken is that it's actually okay to see our future selves as if they are others. But what truly matters is the sense of emotional connection that we have to that other. You know, my kid is another. My wife is another. My best friend is another person. But my relationships with them are close enough that I want to do things for their benefit, their survival, their happiness. And to the same extent, you could make the argument that charity recipient, there's many differences there, right? Because now you've entered in possibly pity and empathy and various other aspects. And yet there's still a sense of responsibility or duty and wanting to help. And I think we have to be careful about the charity analogy, because I don't know that pity would necessarily be the best emotion to dial up for future selves. I could worry that there'd be some backfire effect that I don't even now want to think about that future self. I'm just going to live for today, or future group even. But I think your point, Dave, is like a really good one, that the charity recipient deserves our attention in the same way that I think our future selves deserve our attention.
Yeah, that got me thinking. There's the thing you want to be, right? But then there's all these other ways of thinking about not just what we want to be, but I've experienced avoidance as a way that I shape my future self. Like, I don't want to be that, right? Kind of what you're saying about pity and empathy. There's certain people where instead of going towards the thing that I suppose would be healthier and I want to be, I see things that I say, I don't want to be that. And maybe it's not the best way. I don't know. Is that helpful? I don't want to be that. Is that the best way to think about the future selves, avoidance versus pursuit?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Because in marketing, we talk about assimilation and affiliation and dissimulation, where I'm basically saying I don't want to be like a given group. And both, by the way, both techniques are used in marketing communications, right? Anytime we see a celebrity or some person who looks like they have an ideal life next to some product, implicitly what's happening is the company is saying, hey, if you want to be like this person, perhaps you could buy this car or cologne. But we see the flip of it, right? Many public service announcements trying to get you to not do something, not drink, not do certain drugs or whatnot, is showing you a version of what could happen if you were to do it, and having you try to say, I don't want to be that. Applying that lens to future selves it's again, you guys are coming up with some really interesting questions. It's another really interesting question. And I would love to say I have the answer to that. I don't have the answer to that. I have some suspicions, but I suspect that the positive framing, the assimilation, is probably more motivating. There's an optimism bias where if you tell me things might work out poorly, I'll say, I know that's a possibility, but I don't think it's going to really bear out with me.
I think it's interesting, but I have to say, when I read your book and started thinking about this relationship with our future selves as being this relationship with another person, I shared that with some relatives in my family here, and I started to hear some of their language shift. They would say things like,
interesting.
Oh, thank you, past self, when the dishes were done first thing in the morning. And
fantastic.
At work, we would say, gotta write some notes for my future self so I know what this was about. Like, some of those kinds of things happen.
That's great. It
was super cool, especially for the little ones that are still developing their ability to plan.
Totally.
But what I found is that there were some folks at all of those age ranges who have historically been unable to plan their way out of a bag, and they were unable to embrace any of these things. Do you see personality or affective differences in folks' ability to empathize with their future self?
Yeah, it exists on a spectrum just like everything else does. You think about personality generally speaking, and there are spectrums that need to be acknowledged, right? The idea that you're either an extrovert or an introvert is sort of a dated one, right? Most people are ambiverts, most people are in between. There's people at either end, but they're far fewer. And the same, I think, can be said for the sense of connection and similarity that we experience with our future selves. My own research has found that there is a spectrum there. Now, what I don't know is what determines why somebody might be out here versus out there. I suspect it's a combination of just what we're born with and what we see modeled to us, the classic sort of nurture and nature argument. But your observation that there's some people who can't, how did you say, plan their way out of a bag, right? I think it's probably a good one. Now, one thing I want to add to that is that it's important to pay attention to domain specificity. And what I mean by that, that's a fancy term for saying that we exist in many different arenas in our lives. I am really good at planning out our budget for next year. I'm really terrible at communicating clearly about like work trip plan. And these are both elements of planning, and it's like one of them I find annoying, the other one I like to get into. And sometimes on the outside it may seem, oh, this person is either A or B, but there's a lot of color in between. And I think it's important to pay attention to the arenas in which we excel and the ones that we don't.
I think that is so true, right? We all contain multitudes. I remember finding in one of my children's rooms when they were in trouble, a binder that said, "Parents don't look." And it was full of business plans for an illegal operation. But I was like, oh my gosh, he can in fact write a business plan. I'm amazed. So you just never know. You just never know. It was a wonderful moment. Like, this is illegal, but how cool.
How cool. That's very, very funny. Walter Mischel, the psychologist who's famous for the marshmallow test and famous for the understanding that personality interacts with situations, he famously pointed out that Bill Clinton was able to exhibit a massive amount of self-control in the space of international negotiations, and not so much in, I'll just say, in other
arenas,
right? Yeah, other arenas, right? And I think that's just such an important point to recognize.
I wanted to get back to the things we can do.
Yeah,
I think
great.
We started to get down that road with it's important to imagine yourself as different people. We do a lot of work with organizations and teams and leaders. So there's the personal aspect of this, personal self, maybe as a leader. What am I doing 5 years from? What are things people can be doing? It seems like we're living in an era of unprecedented rate of change. It seems like imagining the future is really important. Imagining lots of future, that's probably actually the wrong way to think about, but imagining futures. What are techniques, practices that leaders can do on their team to help bring about more useful versions of their future selves or organizations?
Yeah, so you're asking a great question. Like you said, let's get back to the practical here. So there's a couple things. So one is on a leadership level, there has been some research finding that a version of the letter writing exercise is actually quite helpful. So this is more on the sort of individual level to take a leader and have them, I actually think that what that research did was ask them to imagine that they were in a time machine and traveled ahead and write about what the organization looks like in 5 years or 10 years. And what they found is that exercise then deepens the communications that leaders have back to their team about planning and gets them to be a little bit less present bias in this sort of short-termist type of way. But again, we're still talking about letters there. Another exercise that I really like that I think gives some appreciation to the fact that there's different selves or even, organizational selves over time is an exercise of, or two exercises. One is backward planning. And backward planning essentially is, let's start from where the goal completion has occurred and work backwards. And that exercise can help illuminate some of the steps along the way that we might have forgotten about or might have overlooked. It can also help illuminate where things could go awry. it's very easy in the forward planning mindset to be optimistic, overly optimistic about the sort of qualities of our future selves to get things done, when in fact, that's like another way of being unfair to them. Another exercise that I really like in the organizational space is to conduct a pre-mortem. And the pre-mortem, of course, is to say, let's imagine things got blown up. What happened? Like, what's the worst? Like, how did they go awry? Why did they go awry? And then what sort of fail-safes can we put into place to prevent those things from happening? So I think those can be effective exercises there. There's other solution strategies that I adhere to, again, on the personal level, but we can talk about how these expand outward. One of which is recognizing that the sacrifices made for future selves' benefits often are undertaken by the present self, right? And that's the version who has to do the thing that doesn't seem all that appealing. And one way to counteract that tension is to try to figure out ways in which we can really make those sacrifices less painful. Could we highlight the benefits of them right now? Could we add in positives to the sort of negative? I think anytime an organization offers a financial incentive for a worker to go through a training that benefits them in the future, part of what they're doing there is making that present sacrifice of taking time away from work more positive, right? And I want to be clear, it's not like people aren't doing this, but I think using the framework of, or rather using the lens of separate selves, separate organizations, and how do I dial down the pain of the present organization, the present self, I think that may open up new possibility that could be idiosyncratic for whatever organization someone's in. But I think that overall strategy of dialing the pain down can be particularly helpful.
That idea of how the current self sacrifices for the future self creates real challenges, right? Like basically, you're asking me to make better decisions today on behalf of a person who, will they actually have a better belly because I skipped that beer? I don't know. Who else knows what's going to happen? But as I was thinking about it, so first of all, I think maybe your thinking might have shifted a little bit on the how much we should be sacrificing our current selves' well-being for future selves' well-being. And just last part of this, in the work context, it feels to me like in the US, we have somewhat of the reverse problem sometimes, where we get employees, workers who are overworking themselves today with this expectation that somehow that's going to pay off later.
No,
how is your shifting thoughts about that?
I think this is a really important question and perspective. So it's funny because when I first started this research, I really was focused on how can we do things now for our future selves? And I was very much focused on myopia being when we are so focused on the present that we miss the future. There's this other time travel mistake called hyperopia, where we're so focused on the future that we miss the present. That's exactly what you're talking about. I'm working so hard because I've convinced myself this is good. This is good for now. It's good for later. And I look up and I've missed the present. I've heard the classic. I'm longtime friends with a financial planner on the East Coast. And he told me a story about it. He had a client who overworked, but also rose up through the ranks. I believe he was a partner in a law firm. His wife always wanted to travel, and he said, we'll do that in retirement. He retires. You think you know where the story is going, right? He dies and they don't get, the reality is she died. And he's left saying, now I have this money to travel, to go on these trips that she wanted to take while I was working. And I don't mean to be sad or dark about it, but I think that to me is like a perfect version of convincing ourselves that we're doing something, we're putting things off for the future in a way that, will benefit it. Well, now I'll have the money to like a really incredible trip. When ironically, hyperopia, that over focus on the future, ironically can actually harm the future self, right? Because it can create a future self that doesn't have the memories and experiences to look back and get utility from. And what's I think particularly interesting about this is that there is a world in which doing things for the present self will not only benefit the present self, but also the future self. The example you talked about in the workplace is I think, a perfect example where my mind goes to, perhaps it's cliche, but my mind goes to not taking vacation time.
And not a cliche, massive statistic. It's just, that is what people do.
That is what people do. And it's going to harm me if I take the vacation day, it's going to make life harder in the present. And I think on some level I say, oh, it'll be great to have the days later on or whatever. The reality is taking those days not only benefits my future self because they're the ones who, they get to take the vacation, they get to look back on the vacations or just the time off. They also benefit my present self because now I get to take my foot off the gas a little bit and be refreshed and recharged and all the sort of things that come with taking time off. So I do think, if there's a bigger takeaway here, I'm definitely not in the camp that we should all be doing more today for tomorrow. I'm much more in the camp that we should all be thinking more about spreading utility out over time and trying to, if you will, balance or harmonize between today and tomorrow and so forth, so that it's not so lumpy, but rather we get utility like spread out across time.
I would be so curious about any research. I don't even know how you would study such a thing, but how do you find that right relationship between chunking out small current sacrifice and future optimizations versus the moment of time, especially in a world that's changing so quickly. So if we're writing letters to our future self, should we aim maybe 3 months out? Because
who knows?
That's keeping that future present imbalance a little bit more realistically, or?
Totally. I think one of the recommendations that comes about when you think about this thorny problem is something that I've heard referred to as the big why, coming back to the big things that motivate me. It's really easy to fall prey to almost be taken on the current of time, and you just do the things that come up here. You do this thing, you do that thing, and so forth. But when we try to say, okay, this question of chunking and what makes sense now versus later, if we pull back and say, how will this activity now, how will this endeavor relate back to the things that matter most to me? And that's not an easy question because you have to think about it. But I think part of doing that exercise can help us decide when it does make sense to really go full throttle at work versus when it makes sense to pull back. Because of the career period that I'm in, I'm going through this a lot. And this particular fall, it was I knew October was going to be a time when I had a lot of things on my plate, and all of them, they really felt like they all linked back to overarching goals. And they could help with literally financially with our family, but also they could help with my career and whatnot. But then I'm looking ahead and I'm saying, okay, there's time in December where the kids are off, but I'm not technically. And you know what? I'm going to take that time and be with them. And that is a mindset that I didn't used to have, because it was if I had the time to work and I should do it. And that's that's a time where I'm going to pull away from the work part and go more toward the home part, which is, those are just two versions of a self. And there's of course many other ones to think about as well.
What a gift you've given yourself though, right? Come on. That's no, it's so great because you're in the middle of that massive ramp. Your book's out, you're doing the circuit, you've done great research. It would be really easy to skip Christmas. So good job.
Yeah. I don't know. I appreciate that. It's interesting because I think if there's anything, I've paid a lot of attention to this end of history illusion, because it's, even in doing this, I start to say, well, this is how things are now. And I have to keep pulling back and saying, oh, and this is how I'll always do things. And I have to keep pulling back and saying, this is how they are now. They may change and I'll have to reevaluate.
But it's really comforting to know that you can always, this is how I'm always going to do it because it's been successful at this point. So why wouldn't it always be successful going forward? Very comforting. I don't have to start beginning.
Totally.
It's just be.
Yeah, that's right.
Can we play a little bit of a game?
Yeah, let's do it.
Can we play Would You Rather?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay.
They have either all happened or I have been currently asked about them within the last little bit. We'll start where we go. Okay. You find yourself at a crucial client dinner where sealing the deal for a big contract hinges on making the client happy. The stakes are high and the client suggests ordering a specialty cocktail as a celebratory gesture. Would you rather join an hunting rapport and potentially securing the contract, even if it means straying from your usual no alcohol stance? Would you rather stick to your principles, declining the drink, but risking the perception that you're not fully committed to the celebratory atmosphere?
Oh, wow. That's a funny one. Also, I don't have the principle of not drinking a client. It's harder to put into perspective.
Whatever.
Yeah. Wait, and Dave, have I had cocktails? I have so many questions. Have I had cocktails already? Is it a triple martini from Mastro's? Or are we talking, can I wink at the waiter and say, just put a half a shot in?
Water, make it right.
Do they do mocktails? Yeah. Come on.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, oh my God, that's such a tough question. That's so funny. But the fact that I'm having a hard time answering that probably tells you where I would land on it. You know what? One of my motivation, I'm like problematically a people pleaser. And so I would imagine, if I'm being honest, I would order the drink but I don't know that I would finish it. Like I would probably get it and I would like toast them or whatever. And I might find a way to either not drink it all the way, or I do remember, I have this memory from like 25 years ago when my uncle loves bourbon, and I do now, but then I was like, I don't know. And he gave me a glass and he wanted to try it with me, and I took a sip and I was like, this is awful. But I really felt bad. I didn't want to say that. And we were outside and he turned and I like quick dumped it over my shoulder.
Yeah, with bourbon?
Yeah. And of course he was like, oh, do you want another? It's like, oh, I'm good. But yes, there's my answer. Sorry if that was too much explanation.
No. So this is so great, because I think from a future self perspective, what you just talked about is your strategy for dealing with something you don't want to have happen. And it's something we do with kids, right? Oh, hey, imagine you and your friends are out and they offer you a cigarette. Let's action play what we do. And so you've got I'm going to do the spy move where I pretend to drink, but actually you're drinking because it's poison.
Yes.
So there's your strategy. Cool.
Hal, this one I wanted to get to. Hey, this actually is something I was last 2 weeks.
Okay.
Here we go. You're a student in the US, your visa is expiring, and facing the choice of a transactional marriage with a US citizen. For practicality's sake, you're stuck at the intersection of paperwork and personal ties. Would you rather hitch the bureaucratic ride, ensuring you stay and studies, even if it turns your relationship into a sitcom plot, or would you rather flip the script, pursuing alternative, even if it means facing the music back in your home country?
What's my home country?
It's a place, I'm not going to say, but it's a place that you really don't want to go back to.
Yeah. I got to say, I think on that one, but by the way, all of these dilemmas are so interesting because they're done in this sort of cold place. I'm sitting in my living room answering these questions. And then what we know from the research is that people act very different when actually, I can tell you about one of my favorite studies there, but let me answer your question. Right now, what I would tell you is, let's go with the visa getting married. And the reason I say that is because I think that would ultimately be better for my present and future selves, even if I have to endure like the sitcom-like situation or whatnot. I was a research assistant on a study, this is from 25 years ago now, that couldn't be done now. But this was two like gender studies psychology professors at Yale, or a grad student professor, who asked women how they would respond if they were sexually harassed in a job interview. And to a T, every one of them said, I would walk out, I would state what was the matter with this, I would basically raise hell and get out of there.
Which is not what happens at all.
Actually set up these job interviews, ostensible job interviews, which were conducted by a research confederate. But you understand why you can't do this now. And the job interviews were videotaped. And in half of them, the job interviewer, like they had a script of questions, and a male interviewer, female interviewee, he would ask sexually explicit, sexually harassing questions. And I want to say 2 to 3% of the women actually said something. They all expressed deep discomfort as measured by nonverbal cues, but very few said something. And I bring that up to say, it's fine and well to say this is the thing I would do for my future self, for my present self, but what will I actually do when push comes to shove? It's hard to make those predictions. And it's a good reason why, to your point, Elise, of role playing, why that's actually beneficial, because it can at least give some flavor of what that might feel like. Sorry to go off on a tangent. I know these are just
No,
questions, and that's a serious conversation, but yeah.
And it's so great because I think find it all back together. If we were to bring some of these things into group and team formation, a letter to our future selves, some visioning, both from, role playing who we are then, and then backward planning and pre-mortems to really flesh that out. And then getting to encounter the hard things. Okay, let's just pretend that actually happened. What would you say?
Exactly.
There's just some really useful tactics. And even if I know in some of those studies, it was like a 16% shift. If you think about those curves, 16% is a lot of shift if you're trying to make change happen. That's a big deal.
Yeah, so I should be clear. It's 16% increase, so it's not percentage points, but it's in some spaces that's small, and others, like if it's a financial donation, if it's voting,
Hey, that's huge.
Huge changes
shifts
that can change the direction of a company, a direction of a country. So
right.
Sometimes with behavior change, a small effect still has powerful impact on outcomes.
Right. Beautiful.
I'd love to keep going. We're at time, Hal, and I know you've got a hard stop. If people want to follow you, they want to learn more about how to learn more about their future self, where should we send them?
So my website, halhershfield.com, has links to everything, including my book that just came out, which really digs into a lot of this, which is called Your Future Self. And then they can also find me on LinkedIn, and my email address is pretty easy to find on the internet.
I can attest to that. You're huntable.
Yes, that's good.
Is that how we got here?
Yes,
Okay.
Exactly.
It works.
This is great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you trusting us with your time and your material.
Super fun conversation. You guys were really like engaging and deep questions, so I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us in the lab. We appreciate our guests for contributing to the thoughtful discussions on the future of work. A quick nod to Podrick, our behind-the-scenes maestro, for making each episode possible. If you've enjoyed the ideas we've explored today and want to put them into action, check out our companion newsletter at labs.newrulesforwork.com for the practical activities and additional resources. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback is the catalyst for our ongoing journey into the future of work. Thank you once again for joining us. We'll see you next time in the lab.